Hello. Today we're going to speak about the Norman conquest of Britain. We're also going to look at the origin of the Normans, the causes of the invasion, and the famous battle at Hastings. We're going to see what kind of economic and political system there existed under the Normans. We're also going to speak about the development of art, culture, and the English language. Now, you remember that upon the death of Edward the Confessor, the Saxon Council of the Wise Elders, called the Witan, was to decide who would get the English throne. One of the claimants to the throne was Harold, the son of Earl Godwin. The other was William, the Duke of Normandy. We must now have a closer look at the Normans and their background. In the 9th century, while the Danes were plundering England, another branch of Northmen, also related to the Danes, were raiding the northern coast of France. These came to be called Normans. This word is a variation of the word Northmen. The Normans settled down on the land conquered from the French king, the territory which is still called Normandy. Unlike the Danes, who retained their Germanic language, customs, and traditions, the Normans assimilated with the French population of the conquered territories. They adopted their culture and a certain dialect of the French language, which came to be known as Norman French. The establishment of the feudal system in France had been completed by the 11th century, and the Norman barons had come into possession of large tracts of land and a great number of serfs. The Normans lived under the rule of the Duke of Normandy. In the 11th century, the Dukes of Normandy were practically independent. They coined their own money, they made their own laws, they held their own courts, and they built their own castles. And as a well-trained cavalry, the Norman knights were the best in Europe. They were formidable fighters, and they would wage wars so as to seize new lands and new serfs. So when the Witan chose Harold the Saxon, or Harold Godwin, as the next king of England, William of Normandy, or the future William the Conqueror, began preparations for the war in order to fight for the English crown. He called upon all Christians in Europe to help him gain the rights to the English throne. No pay was offered, but William promised something more than money. He promised land. He was also supported by the Pope of Rome in return for the promise to strengthen papal influence in England. So, William of Normandy landed in the south of England and met the Saxon army at a little village not far from Hastings. The historic battle between the Normans and the Anglo-Saxons was held on the 14th of October, 1066. The Normans outnumbered the Anglo-Saxon forces. They were also superior in quality because they were all men for whom fighting was the main occupation in life. They were well armed, they wore armor, and thus there was little danger of being killed by an Anglo-Saxon arrow, as firearms did not exist at the time. This is the famous Bayeux Tapestry, which was made by William's wife, the future Queen Matilda, and her ladies-in-waiting, and it shows the historical events preceding and following the beginning of the conquest. The Normans used a skillful combination of heavy armored cavalry and archers. The Anglo-Saxons, in their turn, had a small cavalry which was mainly Harold's bodyguard, and the hastily gathered army of free peasants was poorly armed with pitchforks, axes, or just thick oak poles. It is also important to mention the fact that while William had firm power over his vassals, King Harold could not rely on the earls of northeastern England and Middle England in time of need. The earls moved slowly to Hastings so as to arrive after the battle and support the winner, be it Harold or William. The battle lasted the whole day. I repeat, it was the 14th of October, 1066. And finally, a Norman arrow struck Harold in the eye and killed him. Today, most historians claim that it was not an arrow but a sword blow that killed Harold. And gradually the Anglo-Saxon rose, thinned, and the Normans succeeded in breaking the line of defense, and finally they defeated the Anglo-Saxon army. William ordered to bury Harold with all the honors befitting a king, and then marched to London. And there, on Christmas Day, 1066, William of Normandy was proclaimed as the next king of England, William I. But in history he is more often referred to as William the Conqueror. He ruled England for 21 years from 1066 to 1087. And Harold Godwin's daughter, Princess Githa, was later taken as a wife by Prince Waldemar II of Kiev. In Russian history, he is better known as Vladimir Monomach. The Norman victory at Hastings was only the beginning of the conquest. It took William and his barons several years to subdue the whole of England. After several uprisings in the north, the lands of Northumbria were razed to the ground, and Northumbria became a desert for many years. William the Conqueror declared that all the lands of England belonged to him by right of conquest. The Saxon landowners and clergymen were turned out of their houses, estates, and churches, and 1/7 of the country was made royal domain. The other lands were granted to the knights who had taken part in the conquest and to the Saxon lords who supported William. William made both the great barons and their vassals swear allegiance to him directly. Thus, the European rule which said, "My vassal's vassal is not my vassal," was broken in England. In other words, if a baron rebelled against the king, his immediate vassals were obliged to fight for the king against their baron. Another change introduced by William was the abolition of the earldoms of Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex, which had been established by King Canute. Now the country was divided into shires, or counties, as the Normans called them, and the royal representative appointed by the king in each shire or county was called the sheriff. It was through his sheriffs that the king exercised control over his vassals. To further strengthen his power, William built castles in different parts of the country. The main purpose of the castle was to house the Norman cavalry, which would find shelter in the castle in time of danger, and from which they could start their raids. A Norman castle was usually built on a round hill. First, the peasants dug out a moat and made a drawbridge and used the removed soil to make the hill higher. The moat prevented the enemy from entering the castle. Then a wooden tower was built on top of the hill, and it was surrounded with a wooden wall tall enough for archers to walk along. Later, the primitive wooden castles were replaced with stone ones. Most of the castles were royal property. One of the oldest Norman castles is in York. Its famous Clifford Tower stands on a hill which was made by the order of William the Conqueror himself. The tower is the only remaining part of the old castle, and even now it continues to dominate the neighborhood. The castle of Königsberg in Doncaster is another well-known Norman castle which is frequently mentioned in Walter Scott's novel Ivanhoe. Its central keep with 6 counterforts serves as an example of the earliest Norman fortresses in England. One of the first castles built by the order of the Conqueror was the Tower of London. Its central rectangular part, called the Keep, with 4 small towers, was called the White Tower because at the time it used to be whitewashed. Later, the tower turned into a real fortress. It served as a royal palace, a state prison, a zoo, and a museum. But even now, it serves as one of the royal residences. By 1086, the Conqueror wanted to know exactly who owned which piece of land and how much it was worth. He needed this information to know how much was produced and how much he could ask in tax. And he held the first registration and a complete economic survey. Every man who owned or rented land was questioned and threatened to be punished on doomsday if he did not answer the questions of the king's man as to how much land there was, who owned the land, and how much it was worth, how many families, flowers, and sheep there were, and so on. As a result of the registration, the majority of the population were registered as unfree peasants or serfs, and the information was collected in a special registration book which came to be known as the Doomsday Book. This is a page from the Doomsday Book. I can only add that the new serfs made 79% of the total population of England after the first registration. As it has already been mentioned, in Northumbria whole shires lay in ruin. The peasants had no land to work on and no place to go. They could not even make their living by hunting because vast territories had been turned into king's forest, and that was the land kept for royal hunting. The word forest comes from the Latin word foris, which means out of doors. It was not a wood, though some parts of the territory were wooded or covered with trees. The royal forests were carefully guarded, and no one was allowed to cut trees or shrubs to pick firewood, to say nothing of killing an animal. Domestic animals that could feed in the forest were branded with a mark if their owners paid special taxes. No goats were allowed to graze in the forest because deer hated their smell and would not feed in the place where goats had grazed. A man who killed a deer in the forest was either blinded or had his arm cut off or was even put to death. And so great was the hatred of the population towards the Norman hunters that in the year 1100, William's son William Rufus was shot dead with an arrow by an unknown person while he was hunting in the forest. No wonder that peasants, serfs, and people who were driven to despair by hunger and need did hunt in the forest, thus becoming outlaws. And the famous legendary outlaw of the period is Robin Hood. Ballads describe Robin Hood as a strong, brave, and skillful archer. Together with his merry men, he fought against bishops, monks, Norman noblemen, and even the sheriff of Nottingham himself. Robin Hood's merry men lived in Sherwood Forest and would appear wherever the poor were in need of help. Ballads about Robin Hood were composed and sung throughout the 12th and the 13th centuries. Robin is supposed to have lived during the reign of King Henry II, and that is the second half of the 12th century, and also during the reign of Henry's son, Richard the Lionheart. Robin Hood, though he was an outlaw, was presumably a Saxon nobleman who had been ruined by the Normans. All through the ballads goes the idea of Robin Hood waiting for Richard the Lionheart to return, and then he would lay his bow at the king's feet and subdue to the lawful king whose wicked brother John had taken his place while Richard went crusading. During the reign of King Henry II, there appeared an event which had a powerful effect on the history of English church and social life in the country. The king had a friend who had been with him since his youth. Henry and Thomas Becket, a merchant's son, had shared the pleasures of life at the French court before Henry became king. The king was so much attached to Thomas Becket that he let him know the most important state secrets and even made him chancellor. It was one of the steps towards strengthening royal power. As the Archbishop of Canterbury was trying to make the church more powerful and independent of the king, Henry II took advantage of the Archbishop's death and appointed Thomas Becket as the new Archbishop of Canterbury. The people were awed and shocked because Thomas Becket was known as one of the most boisterous sinners in the country. But when Becket became head of the church, he was completely reformed, and within a few years he became one of the most respected priests in England. But his appointment and reformation caused a serious problem. Now it was Becket who was trying to prove to Henry that royal power was inferior to God's power, and that ran contrary to the king's plans. The former friends turned into bitter enemies, and finally Becket had to flee to the continent. He visited Rome, where he got the Pope's blessing, and several years later returned to England to continue strengthening the position of the church. Becket landed in an unexpected place so as to avoid Henry's men who had been sent to kill him. The story goes on to say that Becket's friends arranged for him to meet the king, and although the king said that he pardoned Becket, he did not kiss his former friend, and that was taken as a bad sign. Shortly afterwards, in 1171, Thomas Becket was killed in Canterbury Cathedral by the 4 barons sent by the king. Even the right to church shelter was neglected. The murder in the cathedral caused such a great shock in the country that the king had to admit that it was, in fact, a political murder, an assassination. And 2 years later, Becket's tomb became a center of pilgrimage, and in 1173, that is 2 years after his death, Thomas Becket was canonized. His tomb still, or the place where his tomb used to stand, it still attracts thousands of pilgrims. And one of the masterpieces of English and world literature, the Canterbury Tales, written by Geoffrey Chaucer in the 14th century, is based on the stories told by a group of pilgrims traveling to the tomb of Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral. 2 outstanding men of letters of the 20th century, Jean Anouilh of France and Thomas Stearns Eliot of Britain, a Nobel Prize winner, wrote respectively Thomas Becket and Murder in the Cathedral. The central idea of each piece is the antagonism between friendship and duty, friendship and treachery for the sake of the state. In either story, Becket is idealized, and Henry finally stands repentant. But it is difficult to say whether he really grieved so much and whether he really repented. Anyhow, royal power was strengthened, and Henry II managed to achieve his aim. With new territorial acquisitions, Henry II's kingdom practically turned into an empire. In the early 13th century, King John lost Normandy and other territories in France. His vassals came over to England to receive lands and titles, and John began to give out the lands and castles of the first Norman barons who had come with the Conqueror to the newcomers. Hatred for King John united the old barons, English bishops, and the Saxon noblemen in their almost open struggle against the king. The barons rebelled and worked out a program which King John was finally made to sign and seal. The document is known as Magna Carta, or the Great Charter. It was signed on the 10th of June, 1215. That was a detailed statement of how the king's government ought to work and what kind of relations there ought to be in a feudal state between the monarch and his vassals. Magna Carta was reaffirmed by every king from Henry III to Henry VI. Today, it serves as the first and one of the most important documents making the unwritten constitution of Great Britain. During the reign of Henry III, the struggle for power in the country turned into a civil war which started in 1264, and the king, supported by a group of powerful barons, was defeated by Simon de Montfort, the leader of the lesser barons and the new merchant class. In 1265, Simon de Montfort called 2 knights from every shire and 2 burgesses from every borough to his parliament. The word originated from the French word parler, to speak. The first parliament, which was quite a revolutionary body, represented the interests of barons, the clergy, and the new class of merchants. During the reign of Henry III's son, Edward I, it was granted by the king that no new taxes would be raised without the consent of Parliament. And at the end of the 13th and the beginning of the 14th centuries, Parliament was divided into the lords, or the barons, and the commons, who were represented by the knights and the burgesses. The alliance between the merchants and the squires paved the way to the growth of parliamentary power. Along with the development, along with the economic and political development of the country, went its cultural development. Most of the English writers, poets and scholars of the time were educated at universities. Already at the end of the 11th century, Oxford was a center of learning. Originally, the first universities in Europe appeared in Italy and France. A fully developed university comprised 4 faculties, 3 superior faculties, those of theology, canon law, and medicine, and 1 inferior or primary faculty of art, where music, grammar, geometry, and logic were studied. University graduates were awarded with 3 degrees: Bachelor of Science, Master of Arts, and Doctor. In the middle of the 12th century, after controversial debates at Paris University, a number of professors were expelled. They crossed the Channel and settled in England, and in 1168 they founded schools in Oxford, which formed the first university. However, the plague led to a temporary dispersion of the schools, but later they were reopened. Another university was founded in Cambridge. Here different dates are given from 1188 to 1209. As a rule, university students would sit on the floor in a room where a master lectured or read from some rare and precious book, while the students were taking notes. All classes were held in Latin. Eventually, Greek and Latin were the languages of the church, science, and diplomacy. We already spoke about it in the previous lecture. The nobles generally had no use for university education in the Middle Ages. It was the sons of the lower middle-class families that became students in the hope of improving their stations in life. Universities admitted only boys. Boys were sent to university at the age of 14, and it was apparent that they needed supervision, decent places where they could have their meals and sleep. They also needed financial support. Sometimes they even needed punishment. All that led to opening colleges with their dormitories and dining rooms, with their tutors and the first student grants. Towards the end of the 13th century, there appeared colleges where more subjects were taught, and it became a custom with students to go about from one great university to another, learning whatever they could from the most famous professors of the time. Merton College is one of the oldest colleges at Oxford. The Norman barons were followed to England by clergymen, merchants, artisans, scribes, and minstrels. Each rank of society enjoyed their own literature. Monks wrote historical chronicles in Latin. Scholars in universities wrote about their experiments, also in Latin. Even religious satires were written in Latin. The aristocracy wrote their poetry in Norman French, but the country folk made up their songs and ballads in Anglo-Saxon or in English. In the 12th century, English poetry was influenced by French chivalric romances. The lyric poets of southern France, called troubadours, invented the dancing songs called ballads. The word ballad takes the same root as the word ballet or ballet. The most famous poet in the reign of Henry II was the Norman poet Wace, who had graduated from Paris University. He was a clergyman, a secretary, a teacher, a writer, and a poet. And it is in Wace's romances that we first come across the name of King Arthur, the legendary Celtic chief. Later, from the 13th to the 15th century, there appeared a series of legends about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. The characters are neither saints nor legendary Scandinavian warriors. They are ordinary human beings who worshipped a fair lady, loved and suffered. Assisted by the counsel of the wizard Merlin, Arthur inherited his father's throne, defeated his enemies, got married, and so on. And when his future wife arrived in Britain, she brought with her a huge round table, round which 150 knights could be seated. 28 knights were found by Merlin to be worthy of the privilege to sit at the table with the king. Arthur ordered to have 28 names written in golden letters on the back of the seats. The best-known legends about King Arthur are Arthur and Merlin, Lancelot of the Lake, Percival of Wales, Sir Tristram, and others. In the 15th century, Thomas Malory collected Arthurian stories and arranged them in 20 books. Now let us speak about the language of the Norman period. The Norman period in the English language is known as Middle English. It lasted from the 11th to the 15th century. The Conquest was not only a historical event, it was also the greatest single event in the history of the English language. One of the most significant consequences of the Norman domination was the use of the French language in many spheres of English political, social, and cultural life. But though the court and the barons spoke Norman French, and though the clergy spoke and wrote Latin, the invasion of those two Romance languages could not subdue the popular tongue spoken by peasants and townspeople all over England. The two main languages, French and English, formed one language by the end of the 14th century. It was predominantly English because it was the living language of the people who lived in their native land, and it was part of their culture. In 1258, the King's proclamation to Parliament from all parts of England was written in 3 official languages, French, Latin, and English. This was the first official document written in English during the Norman invasion. I repeat the date, 1258. And almost a bit more than a century later, in 1349, it was ruled that schooling should be conducted in English and in Latin. In 1362, Parliament for the first time was opened with a speech in English. But the 300 years of French domination in many spheres of life affected the English language more than any other foreign influence before or after. The phonetic structure of the language was naturally affected. It is, however, controversial whether it was only French that affected the grammatical structure of English. Anyhow, Middle English is known as the period of leveled endings. It was a transitional period from synthetic forms, that is, forms with various endings, to analytical forms, or the use of auxiliary verbs. Particularly new were the French suffixes. Ens, as in ignorance, experience, ment, as in government, agreement, age, as in village, marriage, able, as in admirable, available, lovable. The prefix dis gave a negative meaning to the word, as in disbelief, distaste. The suffixes gave an abstract meaning to the words, and they were used to form new words from the English roots. The same period saw as the spread of the indefinite article a or an, stemming from the numeral 1, which in Old English sounded as an. Spelling changed altogether. Instead of the old Germanic rules for the sounds th and the Normans introduced the digraph th. The Old English sound u, the long sound, was changed into ou or ow, as in whose, it turned into house, moose into mouse, and coo into cow. Well, it should be noted that originally ou and ow, this or that digraph, was pronounced as oo, and the diphthongs o and ow appeared only in the 14th century. The numerous borrowings reflect the spheres of Norman influence on English life. Political and administrative aspects of life during the Norman period largely depended on the Norman barons. At the same time, in everyday life, people spoke mostly English, and that led to the spread of numerous synonyms. But words denoting the same object or the same idea cannot coexist in the same language. There can be no full synonyms in any language. So how did they deal with the situation in England? If a word meant something that the English language had had before, then the Old English word remained in use. But if there was anything new, for example, a new shade of meaning, then the language borrowed the French word. Thus, we still have such words as to eat and to devour, land and territory, house and building. The words describing feudal relations or related to the law courts and governing are usually borrowings from French. For example, to command, to obey, baron, council, court, crime, arms, God, battle, victory, and many others. If both words remained in the language, they were at least slightly different in meaning. This was illustrated by Sir Walter Scott in Ivanhoe. A domestic animal in the field was called by its Saxon name, but when it was sent to the table of a Norman baron, it changed its name into Norman French. Thus, we still have such pairs of words as ox, beef, calf, veal, sheep, mutton, swine, pork. Some synonymous words are used in different styles. The English words usually give a homelier idea, while the French ones are mostly used in formal speech. For example, to give up, to abandon, to give in, to surrender, to come in, to enter, and so on. As a result of these changes, the stock of synonyms in the English language is larger than in any other European language, and the English word stock is the largest in Europe. Thank you. Next time, we're going to speak about England in the late Middle Ages, the 14th and the 15th centuries. Goodbye.